Usually, a medical diagnosis carries this expectation of, well, engineering-like precision.
Right, yeah, like it is a simple binary problem.
Exactly. I mean, you fracture your radius, the radiograph shows a jagged white line through the cortical bone, and the clinician simply points to the screen.
They just say, well, there it is, broken or intact.
Spot on. But if you step into the staggering complexity of human anatomy, particularly the cranial and cervical regions, that binary comfort completely dissolves.
Oh, absolutely. It becomes incredibly murky.
It does. It is a deeply interwoven and, frankly, exceptionally unforgiving landscape.
Oh.
And today, you, our listener, the vital third mind in this conversation, are joining us on a journey to understand how humanity actually learned to navigate it.
Which is such a fascinating story.
Right. So we are diving into the introductory chapter of the textbook of Head and Neck Anatomy by Hyatt and Gardner. And our mission today isn't just about naming bones.
No, definitely not.
It is not about, memorizing the branching patterns of the external carotid artery. We are exploring the very concept of seeing the human body.
And that distinction between just memorizing parts and truly seeing relationships, that is the absolute crux of the text.
Yeah, moving from raw observation to functional reasoning.
Because anatomy is not this static dogma just handed down from antiquity. I mean, it is an iterative story.
A very messy one at times.
Very messy. A long history of correction, of refinement, and of a gradually deepening understanding. So today, we are tracing that historical arc.
Right, from the very beginning.
Yeah, from the desperate surgical interventions of prehistory through the philosophical missteps of the ancient Greeks and into the rigorous methodology of the Renaissance.
Which ultimately culminates in why the head and neck actively demand a highly specific regional approach.
Exactly, the spatial approach that clinicians absolutely rely on today.
Okay, let's unpack this timeline because I feel like we need a conceptual anchor before we just start jumping through millennia.
That is a good idea.
To capture the essence of what this text is trying to do, imagine you are trying to understand a massive, ancient metropolis, let's say London.
Okay, I am picturing London.
Right. Now, you could look at a schematic of just the water pipes. That is a systemic view. It shows you where the water goes, the continuous flow from the reservoir straight to the tap.
Right, which is useful if you only care about water.
Exactly. But if you actually need to excavate a street or repair a foundation in the city of London, that systemic map is dangerously incomplete on its own.
You would hit an electrical cable immediately.
Precisely. You need a map of a specific borough showing how the water mains, the electrical grids, the fiber optics, and the tube tunnels all weave around each other in this incredibly cramped, dense space.
And that is the regional view.
That is the regional view.
Right.
And the head and neck. It is the most complex, densely packed, high-stakes borough in the entire human body.
That analogy holds up perfectly when you look at the historical progression, actually, because early humans didn't start by drawing a systemic map of the entire metropolis.
They just started digging.
They started by digging a very specific hole in the street and trying desperately not to hit a vital cable. Which brings us to the dawn of anatomic curiosity.
The archaeological evidence here is just wild to me.
It really is. The textbook points out that brain surgery, specifically trepanation, where a hole is created in the cranial vault, was performed with considerable success thousands of years ago.
I mean, I have to push back on our standard narrative of medical history here, because we always assume complex surgery requires, metal scalpels, sterile fields, general anesthesia.
Of course, that is the modern assumption.
But the text highlights that trepanation was happening as early as 7,000 BC in Europe, 7,000, and 3,000 BC in Africa, and 2,000 BC in pre-Incan civilizations.
And we are not just saying they managed to hack through the bone. When we say success, we mean survival.
Wait, really? How do we know they survived?
Because the archaeological record shows crania with smooth, remodeled bone margins around the surgical site.
Oh, wow. So the bone actually healed.
Exactly. That immunological reality means the patients survived long enough for osteoblasts to heal the fracture. They lived.
It is staggering. How is it conceptually possible that humans were performing successful cranial surgery with, flint or obsidian tools?
Yeah, stone tools.
Millennia before formal science. How were they bypassing the spongy bone between the skull tables without plunging straight into the delicate dura mater underneath?
Without a single anatomical reference text, no less. What is fascinating here is that it completely upends our linear narrative of how science develops.
Right, because we usually assume theory comes first.
Exactly. Theory, then formal language, then practical application. But ancient cranial surgery proves the exact opposite.
It was entirely driven by necessity.
Yes, the drive to heal, the desperate need to care for someone who, perhaps, suffered a depressed skull fracture from a weapon. It forced an intimate, tactile understanding of anatomy long before the language existed.
So if someone takes a blow to the head in 7000 BC and starts seizing,
The local healer doesn't need to know the Latin nomenclature of the parietal bone. They just know, through brutal trial and error passed down orally, that relieving the pressure stops a seizure.
and they were scraping, right, not drilling.
Right, painstakingly wearing down the bone layer by layer with stone tools until the inner table was breached, carefully preserving the meninges.
Mapping the human skull purely by touch, it is terrifying, honestly. You make one error in depth perception, and you lacerate the superior sagittal sinus.
And that causes fatal hemorrhage. But eventually, humanity does cross a threshold where that tactile observation turns into formal, written study.
Which brings us to the Greeks.
Yes, the text points us to a Greek physician named Alcmaeon, writing approximately 2,500 years ago.
And Alcmaeon, I mean, the intellectual leaps this individual made are just staggering. It is like he bypassed centuries of foundational work.
He is a monumental figure. He is credited with setting down the earliest written anatomic studies.
He discovered the optic nerves, right?
He did. But the crucial detail isn't just the discovery of the physical structures. He dissected them and traced those optic nerves back through the orbit into the cranial cavity to the optic chiasma.
Chiasma. That is the specific anatomical point where the nerve fibers from the nasal halves of each retina cross over to the opposite side of the brain.
Exactly. And from observing that physical crossing mechanism, he actually deduced their role in binocular vision.
I really want to pause and just marvel at that. To move from looking at a severed nerve to deducing binocular vision
Is a massive leap.
Think about the physical reality. You are dissecting a body 2.5 millennia ago. No modern preservation. You isolate these two fibrous cords.
And you trace them.
You painstakingly trace them, observe them cross over, and then sit down and deduce, this crossing mechanism must be how the inputs from two separate eyes are integrated to create a single three-dimensional visual field.
He reverse engineered the software purely by looking at the hardware. It is the critical pivot from static morphology to dynamic physiology.
Right, going from just identifying a nerve to functional deduction. And didn't he also suggest the brain was responsible for intelligence?
He did. He discovered the auditory tube as well.
Yeah.
And based on all this wiring, he posited that the brain was the central processor.
Which was a massive paradigm shift, because before him, and honestly for a long time after, the heart was considered the center of human thought.
A cardiocentric view.
Yeah, and a cardiocentric view of consciousness makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? The physiological feedback is so loud. When you are terrified, your heart pounds.
When you grieve, you feel a physical ache in your chest.
Exactly. The sensory experience of emotion is heavily tied to cardiac output, but the brain, it just sits silently in its dark, bony box.
It has no pain receptors of its own. It doesn't throb when you solve a maths problem.
Right. So for Alcmaeon to look at the wiring, trace the optic and auditory pathways, see that these high bandwidth cables plug into the brain, and conclude that this silent mass of tissue is the intelligence center.
It represents a profound shift to strict structural logic.
But, as the source text shows, medical history is rarely a straight line of continuous enlightenment. We take a leap forward, and then we trip over our own shoelaces.
For a couple of millennia, in this case.
Yeah, enter Pythagoras. Everyone remembers him from secondary school geometry, but his medical theories were, well, impactful, to say the least.
He was writing around the same time as Alcmaeon. He agreed the brain was the center of intelligence, but he introduced a physiological concept that essentially derailed precise pathology for centuries.
Four humors.
The humoral theory. He theorized that well-being was tied to a ratio of 4 humors: phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and blood.
And he tied them directly to the natural elements. So phlegm was water and moistness. Yellow bile was fire and dryness.
Black bile was earth and cold, and blood was air and heat.
And the idea was that a disproportionate ratio, like an excess of black bile, was the root cause of all disease, both physical and psychiatric.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is crucial to understand why this specific idea took such a vice-like grip on human thought.
Right, because it wasn't just a fleeting idea, it became the foundation of Hippocratic medicine.
Exactly. It shaped the Western approach to the human body for an astonishingly long time.
But here's what I always wonder. If a physician performs an autopsy, They are not going to find a reservoir of black bile. There is no fire burning in the spleen.
Now, structurally, it makes no sense.
So how did an idea so disconnected from anatomical reality survive for thousands of years?
It comes down to the human psychological desire for elegant, unified systems. We want the chaos of disease and mortality to make logical sense.
We want a pattern.
We crave patterns. And humoral theory, despite being factually incorrect, was phenomenally elegant conceptually. It logically connected the invisible internal environment to the visible external world.
The macrocosm and the microcosm. If the universe is water, fire, earth, and air, then humans must be governed by those exact forces.
And superficially, the symptoms of disease seem to validate it.
Oh, true. If you have malaria, you present with a fever and profound sweating. Fire and water.
If you have a respiratory infection, you expectorate excess phlegm. If you suffer a wound, you bleed. It provided a unified theory that felt intuitively true at the bedside.
It felt right, so it became codified as absolute truth, but surely anatomists looked inside the body and realized the math didn't align with the organs.
They did. But then they ran headfirst into the second great barrier to scientific progress, the overwhelming weight of ancient authority.
Ah, Aristotle.
Aristotle. In the ancient world, there was no heavier intellectual authority.
I think of Aristotle and later the Roman physician Galen as the early operating systems of medical science, like MS-DOS in early computing.
That is a brilliant analogy.
They built the foundation. They were the first to compile a system that seemed to compute the data, so they were deemed good enough.
Aristotle made massive contributions, to be fair. He correctly described the morphology of numerous organs, and he was likely the first anatomist to use illustrations, which is a huge pedagogical leap.
Visualizing anatomy is half the battle. But he also endorsed humoral theory.
He did. And because Aristotle endorsed it, questioning the humors meant questioning the foundation of Western thought. No scholar wanted to commit academic suicide by doing that.
Nobody dared to update the software, even with the bugs. And then Galen comes along during the Roman era, and his influence is even more profound.
Galen was arguably the greatest experimental physician of his age. The source mentions he proved structure and function were interrelated.
He did those painstaking studies of the spinal cord, right?
Yeah.
Demonstrating how specific transactions cause predictable patterns of paralysis.
Yes, he was a master of functional anatomy. But his Achilles heel was Roman law. It heavily restricted human dissection.
So he had to extrapolate.
He dissected Barbary macaques, pigs, and sheep, and assumed human internal structures were identical.
Oh, no.
For example, he found a complex network of blood vessels at the base of a sheep's brain called the ret mirabile, the wonderful net.
And he just assumed humans had it too.
He assumed humans possessed it and integrated it into his theories of how vital spirits were refined.
So the MS-DOS was written using code from the wrong machine entirely.
Exactly. And yet his writings became the absolute gospel of medicine for over a millennium.
Even when those errors led to deeply flawed clinical practices like aggressive bloodletting to balance the humors, the dogma remained impenetrable.
Which raises an important question about how knowledge survives civilizational collapse. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe entered the Dark Ages.
Right. Institutional research basically ground to a halt. The texts were at risk of being lost.
But the text is very careful to highlight the keepers of the flame. The scientific perspectives were preserved and expanded by Persian physicians.
Avicenna, chiefly around 1000 AD.
Yes, Avicenna's The Canon of Medicine is monumental. They didn't just passively store the texts, they translated them, synthesized them, and kept rational medical inquiry breathing.
They maintained the infrastructure until Europe was ready to re-engage, and re-engaging took a painfully long time.
It certainly did.
We jump forward to the year 1224, and we hit a major bureaucratic landmark. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II proclaims a new edict.
A vital one. He stated that anyone wishing to perform surgery must first study anatomy by dissecting a human body.
It legally establishes anatomy as an observational discipline unto itself. It separates the hands-on surgeon from the theoretical philosopher.
But institutional mandates are not intellectual revolutions. The text astutely points out that despite this edict, no major conceptual advance occurred for another 350 years.
3.5 centuries of dissecting human bodies and not seeing anything new.
It perfectly illustrates that you cannot legislate a scientific breakthrough.
Right. If the surgeons dissecting those bodies are still wearing Galen's conceptual blinders, if they are actively trying to find a sheep's rate mirabile because the ancient textbook says it is there, they literally will not see the reality in front of them.
A bureaucratic edict changes the curriculum, but it doesn't automatically change the paradigm. That required a catalyst from completely outside the medical establishment.
The Renaissance, and specifically artists.
Yes. The individual who finally shatters the stagnation isn't a physician at all.
It is Leonardo da Vinci. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Da Vinci serves as the ultimate bridge between medieval dogma and modern scientific observation. His anatomical illustrations added a completely new emphasis to the functional appreciation of structure.
He didn't just draw the surface, he dissected cadavers and displayed the mechanical results, simplifying the complexities in a way no text ever had.
Visual representation became the key.
I think we underestimate how revolutionary visual technology was for this field. Up until Da Vinci, anatomy was locked away in incredibly dense, unreadable Latin text.
Imagine describing the three-dimensional spiral of the cochlea using only words.
Without moving your hands, it is woefully inefficient. Da Vinci realized that proportional, dynamic art is a far superior technology for transmitting morphological data.
He turned a dense theoretical language into an intuitive visual map. He mapped muscles like levers and pulleys.
He made the invisible mechanics visible. And by doing that, he empowered a new generation to look at the body as an engineered machine, not a vessel of mystical humors.
This period allowed the open questioning of secular dogma. It laid the groundwork for the ultimate disruptor of the 16th century, Andreas Vesalius.
Vesalius is the inflection point. He's the one who looked at Galen's operating system, realized it was riddled with coding errors, and decided to write a completely new, open-source system based purely on primary observation.
The intellectual courage that required is just astounding. He stood in front of the entrenched medical establishment and demonstrated that the revered Galen was demonstrably wrong.
Applying strict, uncompromising scientific discipline.
Yes, single-handedly revising the field and writing the forerunner to all modern anatomy textbooks.
He insisted on primary evidence. If Galen's text says the human liver has 5 distinct lobes because he dissected dogs, but every human cadaver reveals a solid liver.
Vesalius argued you must believe your own eyes over the ancient scroll.
He proved the rete mirabile didn't exist in humans. He systematically purged the phantom animal organs from the human map.
And once that dam broke, discovery flooded in. Within a few generations, we arrive at William Harvey, who fundamentally rewrites our understanding of the cardiovascular system.
Harvey's contribution is the birth of true physiological biomechanics. Because before him, the dogma taught that blood was constantly manufactured in the liver from ingested food.
Imbued with natural spirits, pumped out, and entirely consumed by the tissues like wood in a fire. The heart was viewed as a furnace, not a pump.
It is genuinely shocking that until the 1600s we didn't realize blood moved in a circle.
Harvey proved it was a closed loop, and he proved it experimentally with ligatures.
Tying tourniquets around the upper arm, tight enough to block the low-pressure venous return, but loose enough for high-pressure arterial flow.
He watched the veins engorge with trapped blood, proving blood flowed away from the heart and arteries and back toward the heart and veins. Uncovering that structure and function revolutionized medicine.
So we have journeyed from ancient healers scraping skulls to the humors, to Da Vinci's sketches, to Vesalius trusting direct observation, to Harvey proving a closed loop.
We are systematically mapping the metropolis.
But just when anatomists believed the map was nearing completion, the 17th century introduces a piece of optical technology that shatters the scale entirely.
The microscope.
Yes. If we carry our metropolis metaphor forward, it is as if the cartographers mapping London suddenly discovered that the bricks making up the buildings contained bustling, microscopic cities within themselves.
The early microscopists pointed lenses at slices of tissue and realized solid meat was an entire universe of cells and branching fibers.
The text lists the titans of this frontier: Bersung, Malpighi, Purkinje, Golgi, Cachal, Ehrlich.
Each of these scientists drilled down into a level of staggering scale. Malpighi actually observed the microscopic capillaries connecting arteries to veins in frog lungs.
Providing the final visual proof for Harvey's closed-loop theory.
Exactly. And Cajal used Golgi's stains to map the intricate branching of individual neurons in the brain. They proved the structural map doesn't end where the naked eye fails.
And all this historical data brings us directly to the core pedagogical challenge. After thousands of years of accumulating this massive mountain of data, how do you organize it?
How do you teach it without overwhelming a medical or dental student?
Right. The source text outlines three distinct frameworks for anatomical study: systemic, regional, and surgical.
Understanding the conceptual difference between these three is vital. The framework you choose determines how you interact with the patient.
Okay, let's unpack them. First, systemic anatomy. The text states this method treats the body as if it were organized into neat, self-contained functional systems.
You study the skeletal system in isolation, then the muscular system, the nervous system, the cardiovascular system.
It is exceptionally logical for establishing continuous functional understanding, right? Like tracing an electrical impulse from the brain to the big toe.
Yes, it isolates the pathway. Fantastic for an introductory overview or reference textbooks.
But as a functional map for a clinician, it is completely artificial. The human body does not segregate itself by system.
Blood vessels don't live in a separate postcode from peripheral nerves.
They are bundled together, wrapped around bones, piercing through muscle. Returning to our metropolis metaphor, a systemic map is exactly like the London Underground map.
Clean, topologically neat, color-coded.
The Victoria line is blue, the central line is red, but if you are an engineer walking into the actual tunnel, you don't see a clean blue line hovering in space.
You see train tracks interwoven with high-voltage cables, water dripping from a leaky Victorian sewer pipe, and the concrete foundations of a skyscraper pushing into the wall.
Reality isn't segregated, it is simultaneous. Which brings us to the second framework, the one this textbook champions: regional anatomy.
This method abandons the system-by-system approach entirely. It divides the body into specific geographic territories.
The upper extremity, the thorax, the abdomen, the neck.
And it dictates that you must study absolutely everything within that specific boundary simultaneously. Osteology, myology, nervous tissue, vascular elements. You look at the entire neighborhood at once.
You establish a strict bounding box and map every spatial relationship within it, even if the structures continue outside the region.
Right, like the vagus nerve.
Yeah.
It originates in the brainstem and travels down into the abdomen. But in a regional textbook, when studying the neck, you only learn about the segment passing through the neck and what it sits next to right there.
Geography over physiology. And then there's the third framework, surgical anatomy. The text describes this as based on the regional approach, but applied clinically.
Emphasizing surgical techniques, operative approaches, and critically normal anatomic variations.
This is the point I really want to explore. Why do normal variations matter so much? If I buy a map of London, Big Ben is always on the same block. Why is a surgical anatomy map inherently different?
It touches on the fundamental limitation of any medical textbook. A textbook presents an idealized average human, a statistical prototype.
But humans aren't factory-made cars.
Exactly. We are biological organisms governed by messy embryological development. In a textbook, the left common carotid artery branches off the aortic arch at a perfect angle.
But in a real patient on the operating table,
That artery might branch earlier or later, or arise from a shared trunk. Nerves might pierce through a muscle belly instead of running beneath it.
Oh, I see. So if a surgeon enters the neck expecting the perfect textbook prototype, they might sever a vital structure simply because it was 3 millimeters to the left of where the map said it should be?
That is exactly the danger. Surgical anatomy is the clinical recognition that the map is just a probabilistic guide. It respects the chaotic differences of human development.
It teaches the surgeon not just where a structure usually is, but where it might be hiding.
And how to dissect safely regardless of the anatomical hand the patient was dealt.
Which perfectly sets up the grand finale of this chapter and the core thesis for why this specific textbook exists. Section 5. The head and neck as a regional imperative.
The authors make a very strong, uncompromising argument here.
They state that while other regions, maybe the limbs, might lend themselves to a systemic approach, the head and neck actively and aggressively resist systemic simplification.
The head and neck actively punish anyone who tries to learn them systemically. It is a highly specialized region where vital structures are unbelievably compacted.
Consider what is housed here. The brain, sensory organs for sight, hearing, olfaction, gustation, the beginnings of the respiratory and digestive tracts.
The massive arterial supply to the brain and the sprawling network of 12 cranial nerves, all jammed into a small, highly mobile cervical cylinder and a rigid bony vault.
Think of the carotid sheath in the neck. You have the common carotid artery pulsing right next to the internal jugular vein, with the vagus nerve running straight down between them.
All wrapped in a tight tube of fascia. You cannot pull one thread in the neck without disturbing 5 others.
And that reality is the pedagogical synthesis the authors are striving for. They state explicitly that this textbook adopts a regional point of view to promote safer student understanding.
You cannot study the sternocleidomastoid muscle without understanding the spinal accessory nerve that innervates it and the external jugular vein coursing over it.
If you try to learn them systemically, all muscles on Monday, all vessels on Tuesday, all nerves on Wednesday, you will be forced to mentally piece them back together on Thursday when a patient comes in with a laceration.
And human memory under pressure is fallible. That mental reassembly is where clinical mistakes happen.
Because you never learned the spatial relationships together in the first place.
The regional method synthesizes these features for the reader in real time. It correlates the relationships as you progress through the layers of tissue.
It eliminates the cognitive load of having to mentally assemble the final product. It gives you the fully interrelated reality right from the start.
It prepares you not just to know anatomy, but to safely navigate it.
So, what does this all mean for you, the listener? Whether you are a medical student staring down the barrel of a dissection lab or a dental trainee preparing for complex surgery, true mastery comes from context.
Memorizing a list of cranial nerves is just a parlor trick without context.
It is useless trivia if you don't know the physical spaces those nerves occupy, what muscles they cross, and what physiological deficits occur if a tumor grows in that specific millimeter of space.
That is the ultimate takeaway. Anatomy is not a list of static nouns. It is an understanding of dynamic verbs, spatial and functional relationships.
Which brings us to the anchor of our deep dive today. If you take away only one thought from this incredible journey through time and tissue, let it be this. Anatomy is the study of structure in service of function.
And crucially, how that precise structure shapes disease, intervention, and clinical outcome.
Beautifully said. Now, you mentioned a final provocative thought for our listeners earlier.
I did. I want to leave you with this to mull over. We spent this hour discussing how human understanding evolved. Every massive leap in medical history occurred because we changed how we looked at the body.
We developed a new lens, a new conceptual map.
Exactly. So, looking at the limits of our knowledge today, sitting at the cutting edge of science, what invisible interrelated systems in the human body are we completely missing right now, simply because we don't yet have the right conceptual map to see them?
Oh, I love that. The map is never truly finished. We just keep drawing, finding smaller streets and more complex connections. To help cement the foundations of the map we drew today, we have 5 single best answer questions based on the source material. Test yourself. Question 1. What is the earliest known archaeological evidence of successful brain surgery mentioned in the text? Option A, 7000 BC in Europe. Option B, 3000 BC in Africa. Option C, 2000 BC in pre-Incan civilizations. Or option D, 2500 years ago in Greece.
The correct answer is A. While all of these are ancient, the earliest archaeological evidence of trepanation with bone remodeling dates back to 7000 BC in Europe, long before formal written medicine. Question 2. Which Greek physician is credited with first tracing the optic nerves to the optic chiasma and deducing binocular vision? A. Hippocrates, B. Aristotle, C. Alcmaeon, or D. Herophilus?
The correct answer is C. Alcmaeon, writing approximately 2500 years ago, made these deductions. Herophilus came later as a pioneer of Alexandria, and Aristotle, of course, supported the humoral theory. Question 3. According to Pythagoras and early humoral theory, the humor yellow bile was associated with which natural element and property? A. Water and moist, B. Fire and dry, C. Earth and cold, or D. Air and hot?
The correct answer is B. Yellow bile was linked to fire and dry, phlegm to water and moist, black bile to earth and cold, and blood to air and hot. Question 4. What major requirement did Frederick II proclaim in 1224 regarding the medical field? A. The abolition of humoral theory. B. Mandatory use of microscopes. C. The study of anatomy via human dissection to perform surgery. Or D. The exclusive use of Latin in medical texts.
The correct answer is C. This edict formally established anatomy as a vital observational discipline for surgical practice, separating it from theoretical philosophy. And our final question, question 5. Why do the authors of the textbook of head and neck anatomy insist on a regional approach rather than a systemic one? A. It is the only way to accommodate the discovery of new humors. B. Systemic textbooks are strictly for historical reference. C. Structures in the head and neck are compacted and closely interrelated, making isolated systemic study inadequate. Or D. It prevents students from needing access to a dissection laboratory.
The correct answer is C. The dense, complex interrelationships of vessels, nerves, and muscles in a small area require synthesizing morphological features spatially, which the regional approach achieves perfectly. Thank you for exploring the deep history and the conceptual framework of human anatomy with us today.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep mapping your understanding. Here are the details of this episode. Suit, Anna Sync 01. Introduction. Suit byline, suit byline. Susu Glada 01. Before we map the terrain, we must understand why the map was drawn. See Anna 1001. See episode description. Suit Anna 1001. This opening chapter is not about structures, it is about seeing. It traces the long arc of anatomical curiosity, from early cranial surgery thousands of years ago to the disciplined dissections of Renaissance Europe. What begins as fascination becomes method, and what begins as observation becomes science. We follow the evolution of anatomical thought. From early Greek philosophers who linked structure to function, through the persistence of humoral theory, to the revolutionary clarity brought by figures like Vesalius and Harvey. The chapter reveals that anatomy is not static knowledge. It is a story of correction, refinement, and deeper understanding. Crucially, this chapter introduces the ways of organizing anatomy: systemic, regional, and surgical. While systemic anatomy separates the body into neat divisions, the head and neck resist such simplification. Their structures are tightly interwoven: nerves, vessels, muscles, and spaces layered in close proximity. This is why the book and this entire series adopts a regional approach. Instead of isolating systems, it teaches anatomy as it exists in reality: interconnected, spatially complex, and clinically meaningful. This chapter, therefore, does something subtle but powerful. It shifts the learner from memorizing parts to thinking in relationships. It prepares you not just to learn anatomy, but to navigate it. This chapter, therefore, does something subtle but powerful. This chapter, therefore, does something subtle but powerful. Okay, key takeaways. This chapter, therefore, does something subtle but powerful. Anatomy has evolved over millennia, from early surgical practices to modern scientific discipline. This chapter, therefore, does something subtle but powerful. Early thinkers, e.g. Alcmaeon, Aristotle, began linking structure to function, forming the foundation of modern anatomy. This chapter, therefore, does something subtle but powerful. Historical misconceptions, for example, humoral theory, remind us that medical knowledge is constantly refined. This chapter, therefore, does something subtle but powerful. The Renaissance marked a turning point with systematic dissection and accurate anatomical illustration. There are three main approaches to anatomy. Or systemic, organized by systems. There are three main approaches to anatomy, or regional, organized by body areas. There are three main approaches to anatomy, or surgical, clinically applied regional anatomy. There are three main approaches to anatomy. The head and neck demand a regional approach due to dense structural interrelationships. There are three main approaches to anatomy. True understanding comes from seeing relationships, not isolated structures.